just to have it
Okay,
in case I forget. Thanks so much for joining me. How are you keeping?
Pleasure. I'm grand. Yeah, good. Like same as everyone. Just anxious for it all to be over. Anxious to be vaccinated, and anxious for the world to get back to normal. I just missed. I've just missed so many things, but I miss bookshops. I think more than anything. And
Yeah.
on Monday, when everything opened up, the first thing I did, I went into town and I went to every single bookshop in town. I went to Eason's in Stephen's Green Shopping Centre, the one on Nassau Street and the one on O'Connell Street. I went to Hodges Figgis on Dawson Street. I went to Dubray on Grafton Street, and I went to the Gutter Bookshop.
Very good one.
So I went to 6 bookshops, which I think
Oh
is
man.
just about every bookshop in Dublin city centre. And it was just great. It's just great to be back, to have that little
Yeah,
normality back again.
definitely. Well, I'll do my little mandatory introduction. Good evening,
Okay.
everyone, and welcome to the Irish Bookshop Show. This evening, I'm lucky enough to be joined by the most prolific and, in my opinion, best writer in Ireland today, Paul Howard. Paul's a journalist, author, and comedy writer, and he is most known for creating the D4 jock Rosso Carroll-Kelly. And thank you so much again for joining me. But first of all, I'd like to start off by thanking you for building my awareness about D4 culture. I'm
Okay.
from a kind of a tourist destination in Wexford, and the only Dubliners I came across were Northsiders.
Right.
But, on my first day in UCD last September, the first 4 people I came across were from Mount Anville, Blackrock College, and Castleknock. They had the exact accents that you had replicated in your book. How do you manage to get in the mindset of these people, for lack of a better term?
I'd say you knew they were from Mount Anville, Blackrock, and Castleknock because they told you. They generally do, They do love telling people. How do I get inside the mindset? It's interesting. I find it easier to get out of the mindset. Or sorry, I find it easier to get in than I do to get out. That's what I meant to say. I think I hear the voice in my head now. When I started writing it first, I think because I'd had so much exposure to people like that during my youth, growing up in Dublin. I grew up in an area that was as far from Rosso Carroll-Kelly's Fox Rock as it's possible to imagine, and that's despite the fact that it was only about a less than a 10-minute drive away. I grew up in a place called Cromlech Fields in Ballybrack, and it was a council estate that was built in the late 1970s. And I had a very happy working class childhood, and we never had a yacht. We never went to Quinta do Lago on holidays. We grew up without ever learning how to ski. So we were kind of deprived in that sense, but so I kind of looked on people from that world as figures of fascination and figures of fun. We used to go to a disco when I was about 17. There was a disco in the Kleiny Court Hotel, and we used to meet girls from Holy Child Kleiny there, and we'd be sort of chatting them up mostly, and they would say where you're from, and we tell them where we were from, and they had no idea where it was, even though it was like less than a mile away. And they'd say, "What school do you go to?" And we'd say St. Lawrence College. Not a clue, even though it was a mile away. And so I think I was conscious of that kind of two worlds thing that existed in Dublin. And it isn't a north side, south side thing, because within the south side, there were the what we call the haves and the have yachts, and then the have no yachts, and we were the have no yachts. But I think I was kind of listening to those people all my life because they fascinated me so much that when I sat down to write the first Ross column, I kind of had the voice on instant recall. I kind of got it straight away. And now, when I'm writing a Ross book, I'm not writing any Ross at the moment, just the weekly column, but I'll be starting a new Ross book at the end of the summer. And when I'm writing that, I'll be doing it for 10 hours a day. And I'll be thinking in that South Dublin accent, but also I'd be looking at the world from that kind of idiot's mindset. You know, that's essentially what it is. I'm thinking in the through the sort of prism of an idiot. That's how I have to kind of look at the world, and that's the thing I find it difficult to stop doing. You know, when you think in Ross's voice for 10 or 12 hours a day, and you're drinking copious amounts of coffee while you're doing it, it's actually very difficult to stop hearing his voice in your head. You know, and for me, it's there all the time.
Wow. Yeah. One of my favorite elements of the Ross Carroll-Kelly books is the glossary of terms. And you write in a dialect that powerfully distinguishes the characters. But would you have any advice about writing in a dialect, putting it onto the paper, spelling words differently, Roish rather than right?
Yeah, I think it's all about your ear, really. It's about listening. I was really fortunate to meet Maeve Binchy when I was very young. My teacher at school sent me to Dunleary Shopping Centre. There was a shop there called the Bookshop, and Maeve Binchy was giving a talk there to people who wanted to be writers. I wanted to be a journalist, but my teacher sent me to the talk. She didn't really have any advice on journalism, but she was kind of explaining her modus operandi for researching and for, you know, getting dialogue right and stuff like that. And she was talking about eavesdropping, and she said all of her material comes from listening inappropriately listening into other people's conversations. And I remembered that, you know, Maeve used to take notes. She might have even had a dictaphone in which she recorded conversations, and I did that as well when I was writing those early Ross columns and those early Ross books. And the language was a huge part of that. Maeve said, to be a good writer, you have to be a good listener. And I thought that was fantastic. Because when I was writing Ross, that's what I did. I went to schools rugby matches. I got on the 46A. I got on the Dort. I went to Kylie's of Donnybrook. I went to Avoca Hamweavers, and I sat and listened. And I think that's how I was able to get the language right. Now, it was trial and error. I think in the very early books, I didn't get it quite right. And I think I have it right now. But it probably took me 3 or 4 books before I kind of worked all of the errors out of it. But I love phonetics. I love writers who write in phonetics. I love Irvin Welsh.
I was just about to say,
You
yeah,
know, I love there's another Scottish author called James Kelman who was writing in Scottish phonetics long before Irvin Welsh was. And I just love those. There's something really beautiful about the Scottish accent rendered in that way. You know, can he do it? You know, AH, and then can he CANNAEDDAE it. And I think I must have read 100 pages of Irvin Welsh before I actually got it, you know, before
yeah.
I slipped in. So I think I was hugely influenced by Irvin Welsh in that way. Um, but I didn't know at the beginning whether it was possible to render South Dublin speak and North Dublin, because I do North Dublin speak as well in the same way, and that's much more challenging. I didn't know if it was going to be readable in the same way that the Scottish was, and I think initially it wasn't, and then I was able to find a compromise between what was readable but obvious and what was totally incomprehensible, and I kind of found a middle path. So I kind of know now with South Dublinese, it's um, the sort of soft vowel sounds. It's replacing, like in the word smart, he would say smart instead of dart. He would say dort. Um, there's the use of you know, the word like in speech attribution. You know, I was like, and he was like, and she was like. And then there's the use of the word like as a linguistic crutch. It's almost like to keep the engine ticking over when you're like trying to think of like what to say next. And then there's that Americanism. Uh, I think it actually started off as an Australian thing. In Australia they call it the high rise thermals, the HRTs, where you raise the intonation at the end of your sentence, so it like sounds like a question, even though it's like not a question. And I was kind of trying for ages to discover a way to render that in language to be read, and in the end, I went with italicizing certain key words, inappropriately emphasized words and then banging a question mark on the end of the sentence. But it was all trial and error. It was a lot of listening and a lot of kind of trial and error.
Yeah. All the folks in Read Books are wondering, have you any idea what a Wexford equivalent to Ross Carroll-Kelly would be like?
Uh, I'm tempted to say Gordon Darcy. Gordon is a good pal of mine, and we've been working on this children's book series for a couple of years now. We're about to do our third one in the Gordon's Game series, and so I'm only messing about Gordon. I don't know, but do you know what's interesting? The more I travel around the country talking about Ross Carroll-Kelly, the more I discover that every town in Ireland has an equivalent of Dublin 4. And when I started writing the books first, I didn't see any audience for it outside of South Dublin and maybe North and South Dublin. I thought it was very much a Dublin thing because I didn't know if people, in Cork and Limerick and Galway and Wexford and Belfast would get it. And then when I was traveling around the country promoting the books, I discovered that every town has its equivalent. Every town has its area that's a little bit snobbier than everywhere else, that sort of considers itself a cut above, that doesn't want public transport serving it. So I was in Galway once, and I was promoting one of the books. It was during the Celtic Tiger, so this is pre-2008, might have been say 2006 or 2007. And it was pre the crash. And I was on the radio, and I was getting ready to do this interview, and I was going to try to explain to them that, there's probably an equivalent of Dublin 4 and Galway. There's a G4 as well as a D4. And the lead item on the news that day was 2 women had been arrested in Galway. They had a fight in a car showroom over who was going to get the first model of a particular car the following year. I think it was coming in January. They both wanted to be the first to own it, but it came to blows, and they scratched each other's faces, and the guards were called. And it was such a Fionnuala O'Carroll-Kelly story. It was, and I kind of didn't need to say it then. Like, I kind of thought, no, there's a Galway 4, of course there is. And you go to Limerick. Limerick has a Limerick. There's an L4, and Cork has Montenotte. Montenotte is just a fantastic place. If Ross wasn't set in Dublin, if Ross didn't live in Foxrock, if it was set in Cork, he'd be from Montenotte. So I think my grandmother's from Wexford, and I love Wexford very much, but I'm not familiar enough with the kind of socio-economic tribes of Wexford to know where they're from, but I'm sure they're there.
Yeah, it's just full of Dubliners at this stage, anyway.
Do they call them Wexicans, don't they? The Dublin people who moved to Wexford. Yeah, I love that. I think that's brilliant.
It's great. But you're residing in Avoca at the moment, and my mother's from Mockram. And I've noticed that these tiny rural villages in Wicklow have started to take on characteristics from Blackrock and Donnybrook. Do you think there will ever be a day when Ross Carroll-Kelly will consider Wicklow and North Wexford as extended Dublin rather than Boglands?
Oh, listen, when Ross was an estate agent, he considered Mayo extended Dublin. When he was selling houses, I mean, he was the one who called Tullamore the gateway to the Midlands, like he sold houses in Oilgate. He sold houses in Gorey, he sold houses in Rathdrum, and said all these places were within 25-minute commute of Dublin, if you have a helicopter, of course. But I think Ross invented the phrase when he was in his estate agent days. The phrase was, what was it? The commuter belt has just been opened a few more buckle holes or something like that. And he would consider those places to be well within range, but he doesn't really make a habit of going much further than Bray. Like Bray is as far south as he tends to venture. He doesn't think there's anything nice happening south of the Loughlinstown roundabout apart from Una Healy. But who knows? I might set a book in Wexford one day. The next book, the next Ross book, a lot of it's set in Kerry, and he brings his daughter to the Gaeltacht in just outside Dingle, and likes it so much he decides to stay and kind of becomes one of the locals, you know. So if Ross can make himself at home in Kerry, I'm sure he can come to Wicklow and Wexford.
The first Ross O'Carroll-Kelly book I read was Dancing with the Stars, so I'm quite new to the, I suppose, fandom, if you were to say that. But as soon as I finished that one, I read it chronologically, and I noticed that there was perfect continuation between characters and events, and you don't necessarily have to remind the reader that either. You can just pick up from where you left off. How do you manage to keep that continuation throughout all the books, and do you find yourself having to remind yourself about certain characters and who they are?
Yeah. With the books, it's kind of easy with the, not easy with the books, but it's simpler than it is with the column.
Mhm.
With the books, I write one a year, so the last book will always be quite fresh in my mind when I sit down to plot the next one. So I've just finished tonight. I'm going to finish proofreading the book that's coming out in September, and I'm staying up late tonight to finish the proofread. And in a month's time, I'll start plotting the next Ross book, which has to be delivered next year, in January of next year. So it's very fresh in my mind. Like, you know, it's not like 5 years pass and then I sit down to try and do it again. My editor, I've got this great editor called Rachel Pierce, who's edited all of the Ross books, all 20 of them. And this next one in September is the 21st. And she has an absolutely encyclopedic knowledge of the characters. And without her, I'd be totally lost. So she's able to say, well, you know, that character couldn't do that because do you not remember in book 12 where this happened and this happened? I mean, without her, I'd be totally lost. You know, I would be, you know, I would have Ross having a vasectomy in one book, and in the next book he'd father 6 kids or something. Like I wouldn't be able to keep up, you know, the consistent narrative. Where it becomes really difficult for me is keeping the narrative consistent between the books, the weekly column, and the plays, because I've kind of got 3 storylines going on there, and they all diverged a long time ago. I do know that there has to be some kind of narrative consistency between them. So for instance, there was a period there where in the books, Charles O'Carroll-Kelly was married to Helen, Erica's mother, but in the column, he was still married to Fionnuala. And then in the books, Ross had 5 kids because the triplets had been born. But in the column, he only had 2. And the reason that happens is I want to keep the books and the column separate because I don't want people reading the books saying, "Oh, I read this already in the column."
Yeah.
And then in the column, I don't want to give away spoilers for the books. So I've kind of kept the 2 separate, but it means there are these enormous plot, you know, glitches between one storyline and another storyline. And occasionally I try to bring them together again. So there was one week I was thinking, I'll just slip in the fact that he has triplet sons and hope nobody notices. This was in the column, right? I just kind of wrote, oh, the triplets there, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I posted the column on Facebook and on Twitter that Saturday, and my feed is just full of all these people saying, what triplets? When did these kids arrive? So these are clearly people, there's clearly a different readership for the columns than there is for the books. There's 2 different sets of readers. So it's trying to keep them all happy while not leaving big plot gaps between them all. But I think I've kind of given up trying to keep them consistent now. I try to be consistent on stuff like how old the kids are in particular and how old his mates are, you know. So like recently I was writing a scene recently about, it involved Ronan's daughter, Rihanna Brogan. And I don't know why, I thought she was 11. So in my head, she was 11. And then I had to check it and it turned out she was 6. So that's how easily I could forget these things. Rachel, my editor, would totally have picked up on that. But for me, there's 3 worlds. And I've done something different with the plays. The two of the 4 plays were set in the future. And the latest one, Postcards from the Ledge, was set in 2029. And in that, Honor is getting married to a guy called Greg, who's a much older man, and Ross doesn't approve of the relationship. But weirdly, I don't think I'm going to do that in the books. If I'm still writing the books in 2029, which I probably will be because I have a 30-year mortgage, um, I, I, I don't know if I'm going to do that with Honor. I might do something totally different. Um, so one, I don't think one has to follow the other. I've set myself on three different narratives, three different storylines, and I'll follow them wherever they go. And I don't see any great need to join them all up at the end.
Wow. Can we have some advice on mastering eavesdropping?
Well, I can't do it anymore because I got known, my face got known. And for the first few years, I think it was 3 years before anybody knew what I looked like, you know, because I never put my name on the first two books. So people were, that was half the fun of it in the early days. People were trying to guess who was writing Ross or Carroll-Kelly. And but then when I had to start publicizing the books, I had to step out from behind the mask and say, okay, it's me, because I was going on radio shows and television and everything. And I remember one night, I went on Ryan Tubridy's TV show when he was doing the Saturday night show on RTE. And I told this story about going to Avoca Handweavers and earwigging on conversations and Maeve Binchy and everything. And about a week later, I was in Avoca Handweavers because like you said, I live in Avoca and there's a brilliant Avoca Handweavers in the village, the original Avoca Handweavers. And I go there for my lunch at least once a week when in non-COVID times. And I remember I sat down with my tray at a table and I had no intention of eavesdropping on anyone. And there was these four women sitting at the next table and they kind of looked like Ross's mum types. And they stood up with their trays and they moved to another table. And one of them said to me, "We are not making a monkey out of us." So, so I find it really hard. But I don't have, do I have any advice? I mean, look, everybody, most people have one of these, you know, a smartphone now, and there's a recording device on it. You know, it's just, which is a fantastic thing. I think the value in it, in eavesdropping, is that, you know, when we write, I feel this a lot when I read books sometimes, even really good authors I really respect, who write, you know, Booker Prize standard prose, they fall down when it comes to dialogue. I often read dialogue in books and I just think that doesn't sound like a real conversation. But what it sounds like is, what it reads like is a television conversation. And Maeve Binchy told me about that. She said, don't watch Coronation Street or, you know, Emmerdale or EastEnders and think that's what a conversation sounds like, because they're scripted conversations and they're meant to be watched and enjoyed on television. So she said, listen to real conversations and listen to the politics of a conversation, the cut and thrust, who's dominating, who's being passive aggressive, who's gaslighting. She didn't say gaslighting. I'd never heard the phrase then, but that's what she meant. Like, who's gaslighting who, who's virtue signaling, you know, who's trying to sound like, you know, who's trying to drop into the conversation the fact that they go sea swimming and, you know, that their dog is a rescue dog just to get a pat on the back, all that kind of stuff, the politics, not just the words. What are people, where are they coming from, what are they trying to achieve through the conversation, all that stuff. And I think that's the best thing you get out of eavesdropping. It's looking beyond the words and finding what's their motivation for saying that line and that line and that line.
We started the Irish Bookshop show as part of a way of promoting business during lockdown, because Red Books only opened in Wexford town in August 2019 and it spent 40% of its livelihood as a bookshop in lockdown. How important are these independent bookshops for you as a writer and a reader?
Hugely important, hugely important. The thing I love about going into independent bookshops is you always find books that surprise you. A lot of bookshops you walk in and everything is where you expect it to be, right? So, you know, the Ross or Carroll-Kelly books are there.
Irish interest.
Yeah, Cecilia Ahern is there, Marion Keyes is there, the new sports autobiography is there. You know, everything's kind of fronted. Everything is where you would expect it to be, and then you find an independent bookshop, and you get a sense that all of the books have actually been chosen um, individually and personally by the owner. And independent bookshop people working in the independent bookshops, in my experience, always love books.
Yeah.
And you know, you very rarely meet somebody in an independent bookshop who you're going to bump into, you know, checking through your groceries next week, or you know, selling you your cinema ticket. Like, people who work in independent bookshops tend to be there because they really love books. And you can actually see that when you go into a bookshop. You can tell who likes books and who's just piling them high. And so I would say they're hugely important.
Your book, I read the news today, oh boy, about Tara Brown, took years to compile. Did you ever get tired of doing your research, and what motivated you to keep going?
I never got tired of it. It was kind of the opposite, really. I'd spent 10 years working on it, and um, because of the subject matter, like, I was dealing with a lot of um, people who weren't used to dealing with the media, like aristocrats, a lot of them, you know, Lord this and Viscount that. And actually took me quite a long time to get their confidence up enough that they would tell me things. Um, but I never was bored writing the story. I mean, there was a lot of hard work in it. I had to go through Tara's mother, Una Guinness, kept she had about 100 photo albums, which were, you know, a meter long by, you know, half a meter wide, and, you know, 6 inches thick. And she had about 100 of these albums, two for every year of her life for 50 years. And I had to go through all these albums, and it took me about a year altogether. There was photos, and then there was press clippings in them and all sorts of stuff. And it was hard work. There were long days, but I was never bored by it. It was just, they were such a fascinating family, the Guinnesses. Um, Never boring, um, completely uh, unique, disreputable in many ways, hilarious, um, scandal ridden. I mean, they were just brilliant. And then I met so many interesting people. I mean, I met one woman while I was researching the book. She was a friend of Tara's, and I won't say her name, but I met her in her house in London. And halfway through the interview, she excused herself, and she had two lurchers who were sitting beside the fire. And she went upstairs, and she was gone for about half an hour, to the point where I started to get really worried. And then she arrived back down with a harmonica, and she proceeded to play the harmonica, and the lurchers howled and howled while she played the harmonica. And this went on for half an hour, and it's all on my tape. And I recorded all this. And then she just stopped and said, "Oh, sorry, I like to do that with them during the day. What was your next question?" And then the interview carried on. So the list of interviewees was just like the cast of just a really bizarre movie, you know. And it was never boring. It was never dull. To be honest, I was kind of a bit, when I had to actually sit down and write the book, I kind of felt a bit disappointed that the research was over. I'd put 10 years into it. I interviewed over 100 people. I'd read all these albums, like I said, and traveled up and down Ireland, England, America, interviewing people. And when it got to the point where I had, my agent said, "You've got to do something with this book. You know, you can't be like, Tara only lived for 21 years. You've already spent 10 years researching his life." So it took him, you know, it's taken you longer to research it than it did for him to live it. That I would have to actually start writing it. So I realized that was true. And then she got me a publishing deal with Picador. And then once you get a publishing deal, it's really exciting. But along with that, you get a contract and a deadline. And suddenly I had a date by which I had to be finished the book. So that kind of ushered me along and forced me through the last year of it. But when it was finished, I did have that sense of, you know, I've no, you know, reason to go and call on Gareth in Lugalaw anymore. And it happened, we stayed friends right up until the time he died. And I did call on him regularly afterwards. But it was kind of sad for me that it was over as a research project.
That kind of links me to my next question, which is I've watched countless interviews where you talk about your daily routine, waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning. How do
Yeah.
you manage to stick to that on a bad day? Because with lockdown, it's so hard to get driven and get in the mindset for work.
Yeah, you know what? I think I was the opposite during lockdown. I remember just before the lockdown last year being really stressed about deadlines. I was working on a Gordon Darcy book. I was doing rewrites on the last Ross book, which was Braywatch. I was working on. I was about to start work on Aldrin Adams and the Cheese Nightmares, which is a new children's book that's coming out in June. And then I'd also signed up to do a book of columns, the best of the Irish Times, Ross or Carroll-Kelly columns. So I had these 4 projects and they all had deadlines. And I remember being really stressed because I kind of thought, I don't think I'm going to be able to make this, while living a normal, productive life as well. But actually, what happened was when the lockdown happened, it took my life away in the sense that couldn't see my friends, I couldn't go to the cinema, we couldn't go out to dinner, we couldn't go to the theater. So I carried on getting up at 5 in the morning. I didn't, I think a deadline has its own way of motivating you to get out of bed anyway. But I worked later in the day. So I was kind of doing, I was working 5 in the morning till 6 in the evening, sometimes 7 in the evening. So I did much longer days. I never had that thing of it's COVID, I just want to stay under the sheets. Like I didn't, to be honest, I never felt that at all. I was kind of the opposite. I think I made a promise that I was going to use the time productively, which I regret now, all all those Netflix specials I didn't watch. And we have beside our television, we have this big pile of DVDs, and I think my wife wants to throw out the DVD player because she just thinks it's like having a video recorder. It's just so 10 years ago, but we can't throw out the DVD player until I've watched all these DVDs, and they're cluttering up everywhere. And I remember saying a year ago when we were locking down, I said, well, one thing's for sure, if we're facing 12 months in the house, I'm definitely going to watch all those DVDs, right? And would you believe, whatever it is, 13, 14 months on, I haven't watched one of them, and they're still there, so I think they might be going in the bin this weekend. DVD player.
Finally, Ross has his own podcast, and he has had plays performed in the Gaiety and the Olympia featuring Rory Nolan. How does it feel to have something you created being performed in the theatre, on the stage?
Well, initially it's terrifying. When you write it originally, when I write my plays, I've got some kind of sense that this might potentially be funny, and then you bring it into the room and you sit around a table with the actors and everyone reads it and everybody's cracking up laughing, and you think, oh my God, it is funny, and it's a huge wave of relief. And then you're watching it performed, and as the actors go off book, so they have the whole thing learned off by heart, and then they start rehearsing, and while they're rehearsing, they're investing character into the lines, and they're making them even funnier than they were when you wrote them. And then a thing I do, I don't hang around the rehearsal room at all. I let the director and the actors get on with it, because if the writer's there, in my experience, the actors experiment less, because they think I'm not the kind of writer who would insist on them playing my lines to the letter. If they can think of a funnier way to say something, if they can think of a funnier line than I've written, I'm fully behind them completely changing it. And then on the night, if somebody says that was a really funny line, and I'm secretly going, that was Rory Nolan who did that, but I never declare it, but what happens then is I disappear, and then I come back, and it's getting, you're laughing your head off. But then as you go through the weeks of rehearsal, you could do up to 4 weeks of rehearsal before a new play. And in week 4 with a comedy, nobody's laughing anymore because everybody knows the lines so well that they're no longer funny. So there's a moment of terror between the final rehearsal and probably 24 hours later, the first performance, the first preview, when you really don't know whether it's funny. You're actually asking yourself, was it ever funny? And to sit in the theater and to listen to the lines and to hear the first laughs, and then, you know, to listen out for, is this is a big laugh coming up, and then it gets a small laugh, but then you think there's a little laugh coming up here, and then it gets a huge laugh and a thunder of applause, and you never know until you're in the theater listening to the audience what's funny, what works and what doesn't work. And I'm the worst judge of my own comedy because I write lines that I think are hilarious, but they roll like tumbleweed through the theater, and then we take them out, you know, after the first preview. And then I write jokes that I think are just easy, obvious jokes, and they bring the house down. So you never really know. And it's that terror. It's like my stomach would just be up and down, like it's like riding a fun fair ride, you know. It's like being on a Big Dipper or something. um uh, Utterly terrifying, utterly terrifying. But then when you discover what works, then you can go along and relax, you know, and then you find it interesting because different, like a Tuesday audience would laugh at different things to a Friday audience, for instance. So every audience has its own personality. So, and I find that part of it really interesting. But Ross on the stage, I mean, that blows my mind still, because I remember the day I created the character, you know. I remember writing the first column. So the idea that, you know, like, I think it's something in the region of 150,000 people have been to see Ross on stage between the 4 plays, you know, that just blows my mind. Like, you know, to sit in a theater and among the people you were originally meant to be sending up, and to see all these Foxrock dads and dorky and climbing moms sitting in the audience, like, you know, hooting with laughter at this character on the stage that you invented. It's the ultimate gratification for me. You know, it really is such an ego trip, which is why, you know, my wife always has to tell me to stop going to the theater to see my own plays when one's on, you know. You can kind of, because every audience's reaction is different. Like, you can go in on a Thursday night, and, or say a Wednesday night, and it's a quieter audience because midweek nights tend to be sober nights, so they're more sparing with their laughter. But you know, a Friday night is coming and everybody's going to be tanked up, which means they're less self-conscious about laughing. So I might go on a Wednesday or a Thursday, and then I'll say, I might just pop in tomorrow night, and then Mary will just put her foot down and say, Paul, you can't keep going, like, you know. But you have that fear of missing out because, you know, the next time you meet the actors, they might say to you, oh, you should have been here Saturday night, it was the best audience yet. And you kick yourself for missing it, you know. And it's just pure narcissism. It's just purely missing having your ego fed by this laughter. But to be honest, you know, why else would you write comedy except to, you know, to make people laugh, and for them to tell you that you made them laugh, and to hear them laugh.
Absolutely. Paul, thank you so much for joining
Absolute pleasure.
And it was a pleasure to meet you, albeit online. Hopefully someday I'll meet you in real life.
Yeah, that would be great. Okay. Well, thanks very much for the interview, and thanks for the really